Hello. Rianne here. Welcome to our first Semantrix members exclusive with Jeremy Narby, where we talked about all kinds of things: semantics in the Amazon, some of the conceptual categorical discrepancies between indigenous ayahuasca use and Western discourse. We talked about where the idea of mother ayahuasca comes from, dichotomies and opposites, invisible versus immaterial, and why that's actually really important in these cultural translations. We talked about melodies as entities, transforming into animals, turbo boosting the imagination, where the word person comes from, really all kinds of illuminations. So, most notably, Jeremy is the author of 3 pretty groundbreaking books: The Cosmic Serpent, Intelligence and Nature, and most recently, Plant Teachers. So, The Cosmic Serpent was one of the first books that I read on either psychoactive compounds or indigenous cosmologies, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that particular literary initiation. And for many years, since reading The Cosmic Serpent, actually, I've been captivated by something that he mentions in that book called language twisting, which is a type of obscure, metaphorical, poetical language spoken by the Yaminawa ayahuasqueros. Because in the ayahuasca state, with normal language, you'd crash into things. And I've been in search of other examples of this kind of psychedelic code switching ever since, with somewhat limited success, but that's a topic for another day. So we're super grateful to Jeremy for taking the time to talk to us. Also, we were gently called out for our somewhat unconventional interview style. Our approach to conversational turn-taking is occasionally kind of maniacal, occasionally sedated as well. But also, or equally, we don't really conceive of these conversations as interviews. And we hope that the result of this is something pleasantly unpredictable. And we hope you enjoy it. So.
You know, I was actually, I don't know, naive enough, I guess, to believe that vampire angle would have some success, because you just look at, white people like vampire stories. But when they become stories about how they have vampirized the world, I guess they like them a little less.
Have you experienced quite a backlash then?
No backlash, no backlash, forelash, no lash, just sort of nothing.
Was it more that you were hoping that people's behaviors and kind of the structure of that type of conference would change, and it feels like it's stagnated where it is?
No, but because, I don't think you can just stand up and talk and then people's behaviors are going to change or something. But I looked at it more in terms of a story that might work, that a story that people would talk about, say, well, this is interesting. And, it was right around the time of Black Lives Matter getting started. So, what does it mean to be white? I actually thought that the average Western guy who goes to the Amazon and hangs out with Amazonians and then finds that he is considered a vampire, and then thinking about it realizes that it's a pretty good metaphor for the last 500 years, would have been an interesting place to, it could have been in the New York Times, for goodness sake, in terms of, okay, Black Lives Matter, and so white, and what is white, and how do other people perceive white? But actually, no. So there it goes.
It is.
I'm not complaining. I'm not complaining. I'm actually more saying thank you for bringing up the vampire, because precisely so few people have done so since Girona. That's really? All I'm saying.
It's really stayed with me. It's something that I think about in most contexts where things to do with ceremonies, and these, well, obviously any ceremony is cross-cultural if we have the opportunity to go to it by us being there, but it's something that comes up again and again. So thank you for a metaphor that I hope has changed my behavior in some ways, even if that's obviously not the same as the story being picked up globally, which I think
It's probably quite a for most people. I mean, you're probably more sensitive than most people, but for most people to sort of think, okay, wait a second, even though I know I'm not a vampire, these other people see me as a vampire, and because of the historical trajectory of my culture, that it actually makes sense from their point of view, and so therefore I have these extractive tendencies that I'm unaware of, and that I'm actually going to work on becoming aware of and then change, is quite a bunch of loops that most people that are not that intuitive to most people, or something. I don't know.
Do you think maybe maybe like a Kafkaesque like parasite metaphor might have been
how so?
stronger? Well, as you say, there is that sort of romanticization of vampires, and perhaps the stronger connotation is sort of Transylvania, and that sort of convolutes it maybe. I'm not sure. I find it surprising that that's not stuck with
oh yes, because I can see how if you could start to feel notorious rather than just villainous, then that it kind of develops this glam within our culture, which it wasn't intended to have when it was originally birthed as a metaphor.
Well, it's true that there's a glamour attached to a lot of vampire stories that do have popularity, and it's true that in the one that I was proposing, it's almost the contrary of glamour. I mean, it means that you're ill and fixated on extracting without limits.
Was that your metaphor, or
no? That's how Amazonian people see white people. And we have white skin because we live underground, so we're pale, kind of sickly, and obsessed with extracting. And we can extract as much as we want. We're never satisfied, and so we're like vampires with a bottomless thirst. So we're sickly, basically.
Do they have the word vampire then? Is that?
Well, the word is pishtaco.
Yeah.
And what a pishtaco is a white person who lives underground, who occasionally comes up to the surface, captures indigenous women and children, puts electrodes into their bodies and extracts their body fat to produce fine oils for their technology. So translation, vampire. And that's not my translation.
In some ways, barely a metaphor in terms of what the Western world has actually done to these habitats and places. So I wonder if also maybe there's a bit of being inured to it and willfully blind to it for people that have had a totally urban existence. Because I mean, if you live somewhere like London, then everything that you eat and wear has been got from somewhere else and brought there for you, and you're kind of maybe need to kind of keep up a blindness in order to be able to deal with the fact that you're essentially just living out that metaphor. It's not even really much of a metaphor.
That's right. And actually, as we're talking, it reminds me that in 1992 in Europe, people were celebrating the 500 years of the discovery of the Americas. And there was a World Expo in Spain precisely that year with that theme. And some folks, I mean, the indigenous people in the Americas were pointing this out. Anthropologists like myself were at a modest scale pointing it out, that it was much more of a genocide than a discovery. But this wasn't something that Europeans wanted to hear. They wanted to celebrate Christopher Columbus, and it's true that the discovery of the Americas was an important moment in human history, and sort of turning it around and pointing at 70 million dead from Patagonia to Alaska, many of which were deliberate and certainly not all attributable to illnesses, that it just wasn't a message that got relayed in the media, that even if you published a book about it, it didn't work. People didn't, they just didn't want to hear about it. It's kind of like a mirror with stark neon lights. And when you look at it, you can see all the faults, all the spots, all this. So it's kind of good for you to go up close and see with the imperfections. So because it can help you get rid of them. But most people don't like that kind of mirror. So maybe that's why in 1992 it didn't work, and maybe that's why in 2019 the vampire didn't work also. You know, it's not the kind of image that European and North American people want to have of themselves.
But in 2019, do you feel like the world was now ready for what you tried to say in 1992?
Yeah, probably. I think that the idea that indigenous people count and that we kind of ran roughshod over them, I think now is a lot more hearable. So maybe let's calculate that, that would be, let's say, almost a 30-year difference. Maybe in 25 years, they'll be ready to hear about their vampireness. Who knows? It's interesting to see with the hashtag Me Too and so forth that things that would not have been imaginable 10 years ago, you know, sort of like, I don't know, male actors who consistently hit on women, you know, at 10 years ago, that's just how it is. It wasn't even news. Now it's you know, it's the end of the career for whoever. That's progress, and it does show how quickly things can change.
I suppose the other encouraging thing about it is that it shows that wrongs can have been committed a very long time ago, and they can still matter now if someone brings it up, which I think in terms of repairing what's been done to some of the indigenous communities, I mean, that's kind of, as you were saying, about the 500 years, it's been a sustained pillaging. And so for there to be kind of retrospective recognition that goes all the way back, I wonder if Me Too maybe makes that look more possible.
You know, I think this would require some analysis, which I certainly haven't done. So this would be just like guesswork. But it does, so there does seem to be an increasing need or possibility or demand for accountability towards women, towards non-Western cultures, towards Black people, and so forth. You know, and the history is full of atrocities and unrecognized injustices, and and the accountability, I think it is possible that it's catalyzed by technology. In other words, anybody can film a police officer choking to death a fellow on the streets in Minneapolis. And so that we can, I think that it's certainly true that by being able to record sound and image, 8 billion people, more or less, or I don't know, 4 billion people have cell phones and are like journalists, so they can record what goes on. And so this makes accountability a lot more probable. You know, you can actually, because if you just say, oh, I saw them do this, they can say, no, that didn't happen. But if you film it, it's evidence. So maybe the technology has jump-started a culture of accountability, and that this is gradually working back in time too, even though nobody was filming what happened 500 years ago. Once you get the ball rolling of oh yes, accountability, oh yes, oh, you can't just do those things. Maybe there's a sort of a cocktail of elements that have come together recently and that have set this accountability ball rolling. I don't know. I'm just, what do you think?
It's difficult though, isn't it? If you're talking about 500 years ago, because we weren't there. It wasn't us, and it just, we get it in Mexico a lot. This kind of conversation about like colonization and the British.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't there, so it's sort of like whose role is it to take the accountability? You know?
Yes, but if we listen to indigenous cultures, they tell us that the past generations and future generations are important, that somehow we do have a responsibility for what our ancestors did, if only because we're standing on their shoulders, we're standing on what they accumulated through history. So that, and this is one thing that white folks like us have tended not to see, is the enormous privilege we have to be open-minded, generous, feminist, pro-indigenous, well-educated, all the books we own and have read, and that we just think we're open-minded and good people, but actually, to be in our position, we stand on top of a lot of white privilege, so that actually looking at the last 500 years, even in just personal terms, the parents of my parents and their parents, and my maternal grandfather was a colonel in the English army. My paternal grandfather was an Egyptian businessman. I'm not telling you about my grandmothers because they were wives at that point. But basically, my grandparents participated in the colonial enterprise of global capitalism.
It's so tempting to think that that's not a choice that you would have made, but it's just impossible to know, isn't it? Because you'd be in the paradigm of that.
And I suppose
time.
some of the trends when they were getting started, like with the Industrial Revolution, everyone was so excited to be inventing all of these machines and changing their way of life, and it was called the Enlightenment. And it wasn't until we wrecked the planet with it that it became obvious that it wasn't much of an enlightenment.
But you see, I think that, I mean, that's definitely true, but I think that self-criticism is a key. And if I turn the critical gaze on myself, the young anthropologist who went to the Amazon full of humanitarian certitudes, I wanted to help the Ashaninka people defend their territory from the encroachment of the World Bank. Wonderful. Applause. But to do so, I was going to do traditional anthropology, in other words, extract data, turn it into a PhD, become a doctor. And that even though in my mind I was an idealist who was trying to help the indigenous people, actually, it was quite true that I was also a typical white extractivist who was there for ego-centered reasons. So an extractivist, what is it? An ambitious, career-oriented extractivist standing in a long line of the same. It's only once you get to the point where you realize, it's not only everybody else before me who was in that culture and logic, but I myself too. So then what do you do? Well, then you can actually, once you realize that, then you can actually try to make a change. And instead of continuing to extract, you can, for example, decide to give back. But that's just saying. So I think that it's possible. It's difficult to look at the past with clear eyes. And it's even more difficult to look at the past, one's own past, and how one fits into that, even if one thinks one is very different from one's family. In French, they say the apple never falls very far from the tree.
I do think you want to give yourself some credit, though. What you did in sort of translating certain non-Western paradigms and how well you narrated struggling with that translation, I think is an incredibly sort of positive thing.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of think it was kind of the least I could do. In other words, when you stand in a long line of white extractivists, to call a spade, and then suddenly you realize, oh, wait a second, there's something that's quite off with this and problematic. The least you can do is step away from it, try to discuss it, share the point of view, wrap it into a story that people can get. So
yeah.
It's like I view that as like the minimum service.
Yeah, I mean, you've given some really valuable commentaries on when we're saying words like spirit, that's just so far from what anybody of community might be referring to. And I think that's just so important, especially as a sort of ayahuasca tourism kicks off, and there is this recognition of indigenous communities, but often in a sort of virtue signaling way, so to be able to deconstruct some of that language, yeah, incredibly valuable. I was wondering if there are any other terms, because you mentioned spirit in a few places and how inaccurate this is, but are there any others that are particularly annoying?
Yep. Okay. Sacred. Nature. And let's just say body. But I'll start with sacred if you want. It means separate from in Latin. It's in opposition to profane. So there's a dichotomy. What is sacred is contrary of profane. What is profane is the contrary of sacred. Profane is everyday life. Sacred is separate from everyday life.
Like sacar, is it from that same root?
It's from the Latin for separate.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can look it up in the dictionary after if you want to. Okay, that's not, there's nothing criminal about making things separate. But when you're talking about Amazonian cosmologies or worldviews or, systems of knowledge, they consider plants and animals, for example, as people like us. They don't posit any kind of separation between humans and all the rest. In fact, they say that each species is a human in their own point of view. So it's more a question of multiple points of view and so forth. So when Europeans, North Americans go and they say, oh yes, well, ayahuasca, it's a sacred plant of the Amazonian people, and their shamanism is their sacred system of understanding, so on. But no, the whole point is that there's nothing separate. That is the whole point, is that there is no separation between humans and all the rest. And it's the recognition, on the contrary, that all the rest are members of our family, and that instead of making anything sacred, there is the will to recognize kinship and proximity, and more relative. I mean, you're more or less close to some species. Poisonous snakes are less kin than manioc plants. So there's just like with your relatives, there's some relatives you feel close to and others less close to.
But so, it's not a hierarchy. It's not
a hierarchy, but it's just like in kinship. Some plants are sisters, some animals are brothers-in-law. You may get on very well with your brother-in-law and not that well with your sister. That depends on the precise relation, but normally you get on better with your sister than with your brother-in-law. And it's true that you don't choose your biological sister, but that's also one of the interesting things about how Amazonian people negotiate kinship. They make it up. So when an anthropologist comes into a community, people come over and say, so shall we be brothers or brothers-in-law? And you say, what? They say, well, look, brothers, it means we share things. And brothers-in-law, it means we're a bit more distant and we become trading partners. And so then you say, oh, well, let's be brothers then. Okay, brother. And then off you go. You can become somebody's brother or sister just like that. So that's also how they go about relating to the natural world. But the whole point is that there is nothing that is sacred. Or if you're going to say then, well, actually for them, the whole world is sacred, then the word doesn't mean anything anymore.
Yeah.
So it's actually one of these European words with a Latin root that continues the good old dichotomy between, it creates these kind of categories, we think sacred is good. Ah, the sacred. Who's going to be against the sacred? But it's just one of these weird Western categories that, and it has certainly no place in the world of indigenous ayahuasca.
Do they have less opposites in general? Because I guess when I think of sacred, I automatically think, well, I guess the opposite of that is profane. So you've got this kind of binary spectrum thing building. But yeah, I'm just curious about whether opposites are kind of less of a feature in general.
You know, I think that's a really interesting question, and some anthropologists have written about it. That actually dichotomizing is a fairly universal human thing, and some people suggest it's because on the one hand, on the other hand, we have two hands, two eyes, etc. So we're pretty bilateral. Our brain is too. And so that it's almost natural to think in terms of opposites. So, and actually, the problem with the word spirit, when you look at it from an Ashaninka point of view, these are Ashaninka or Amazonian people. Their word that anthropologists translate as meaning spirit is maninkari. Maninkari means those who are hidden. So these entities or beings that are inside all living beings. In their language, they call them those who are hidden. And it relates to a kind of a dichotomy between what you see and what you don't see. So they are saying, we live in a world where we see plants and humans and animals, but under the surface, what we don't see at an invisible level are these beings called maninkari. So their worldview is articulated on a dichotomy between visible and invisible. The word spiritus means breath of God, and if you look in the dictionary, it implies an immaterial principle. The whole idea of spirit is that it corresponds to something that there's a contrast, a dichotomy between matter and spirit is what has no matter. The Ashaninka never said that the Maninkari have no matter. They said that they are most often invisible. So it's a different dichotomy. It's not matter versus non-matter. It's visible versus invisible. But in the Ashaninka opposition, I'll end here and give you back the mic. What is invisible sometimes can become visible, or you can see the invisible using plants like ayahuasca and tobacco. There is no absolute opposition between visible and invisible. And this is what anthropologists have found about the dichotomies of indigenous people around the world, is that they are a lot more permeable. The oppositions are a lot more permeable. You can think of the yin-yang symbol, where the white has a little bit of black in it, the black has a little bit of white in it. There's never this pure absolute opposition, and that's what is typical in Western metaphors, is the absoluteness of the oppositions.
I think sound is a really good way of perhaps for Westerners to understand that of this, because we don't think of sound as immaterial necessarily. Like we understand that that's a terrestrial thing, that's invisible. We sort of know enough about what sound is. I think that most people wouldn't consider it immaterial.
Actually, what's interesting is that the indigenous Amazonian people consider that the invisible beings like the Maninkari created life through sound. And sound is these beings, these invisible beings that they perceive in their ayahuasca visions, for example, what they are finally is vibrations or melodies that the owner of tobacco, the being inside tobacco plants, finally, if you pay attention, when you perceive that entity in an ayahuasca vision, that entity emits a melody or vibrates. And what you can do to communicate with the entity is to learn that melody and sing along. And so at these invisible essences that animate living beings, their essence is to be a melody.
And is that the birth of most Icaros? Is the entity will appear and then it will be this communion and the person will kind of return from the experience with this new musical knowledge?
You know, there's a book that I think people who are interested in ayahuasca should read. It's by an anthropologist called Peter Gao, who passed away not so long ago. It's called An Amazonian Myth and Its History.
Is it
But it's all about the Piro people.
Yeah.
And he explains it probably more clearly than anybody I've ever seen. And it is that ayahuasca shamans perceive these powerful beings in their visions. They pay attention to the melodies that they emit. They sing along with them, and these melodies become Icaros at that point. But as they sing along, they see from the point of view of the powerful entities. So it's as if you're listening to, I don't know, Joan Armatrading singing. You sing along with her. And as you do so, you start to see the world through her eyes. That's the idea.
And perhaps see isn't the right metaphor, right? Because it's
seeing.
It's perhaps not necessarily vision, that it's actually more rooted in other senses, maybe.
Well, actually, you know, maybe Peter Gao and the Piro got it wrong, but they are pretty insistent on vision, that there is, as you sing, you see, and seeing. It's not just about seeing hallucinatory images. It's also about understanding, seeing clearly. But I think, yeah, they emphasize seeing in this particular domain.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of Sid, the metaphor of around see in English, where if we see, I see what you mean. We're not actually talking about vision, we're talking about understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard many iterations of this idea that most indigenous communities who use these plants don't emphasize the visionary aspects as much as
there's definitely an overemphasis on visions in Western culture, that's for sure, and an overemphasis on DMT that in ayahuasca, that's also for sure.
What's the mother ayahuasca as well? Sorry, I'd have to.
Sorry.
The mother ayahuasca concept, is that?
Okay, well, hold on. Let's just finish with seeing first, okay? I just say that if you look at some of the classic ethnographies, which I think can serve as references, and this one is in French. It's unfortunate it's not in English, but it's an important one. It's by Jean-Pierre Chaumet. It's called in French, Voir, Savoir, Pouvoir, which is to see, to know, to have power. And this is about the ayahuasca and tobacco shamanism among the Yagua people in the Peruvian Amazon, written in the 1970s. And so he says, this is how the Yagua see it. You have plants that allow you to see. What do they allow you to see? You can see everything and anything. And this is the ABC of the shamanic approach. You take these plants to see. Once you have seen, you have knowledge. And once you have knowledge, this gives you power. Power to do what? Different things. Power to heal, power to get information, power to harm people. But that is the central approach to knowing the world of Yagua people. And you get this time and again. I mean, Amazonian people have nothing against seeing. But it's true, they also understand. You see, for example, in with ayahuasca, pure liana will give you darker images, slower images, less colorful images, maybe even not images, but understandings. Like it could just be silhouetted gray clouds in the sky kind of images, but as you're seeing them, you're getting understandings. And all this would be considered seeing. And yes, the DMT fireworks, if they were thrown in on top of that, would be distractions. And that the important part, well, first of all, one of the important parts with ayahuasca is what it does to the body. So it purges, it cleans. Usually when you're purging is often when you get the most intense visions, images, understandings. All that said, I think it would be incorrect to say that the emphasis on vision and seeing is Western and that indigenous Amazonians discount that. I think that would be incorrect. I think that they consider that these plants, these teaching plants, do help one see images, learn things, and also come to certain understandings. And that's central to their approach. So that ayahuasca is something like a microscope. It allows you to see what you don't normally. And microscopes are all about seeing as well. So I wouldn't discount seeing too much.
Something I'm really curious about, and which I think does maybe link in with the idea of Mother Ayahuasca and the feminine as well, is how the indigenous communities feel about ayahuasca tourism, and when they have people that are from urban contexts there who might be maybe missing the messages of the teacher plants, or kind of not necessarily seeing what they're being shown, and kind of what happens in the cosmological world when there's kind of a brain there having the experience that's not necessarily aware of what they're experiencing or kind of keyed into the cosmologies that they normally work with.
Maybe you all are developing a new interview technique where you ask good questions, but in other words, you ask one good question, and before I can answer it, you ask another good question, because I haven't even answered the Mother Ayahuasca question yet. But I'm happy to answer the one you just asked first.
We enjoy non-linearity.
Okay. Well, look, I'm historically trained, so I'll just do it chronologically. Mother Ayahuasca. Let's just see. If you look in Amazonian cosmologies, Amazonian people have a good understanding of plants, animals, let's just call it nature, even though that's another one of those problematic Western words that we can get back to if you want to. But, or you could call it biology. And it's just obvious that life is an association of masculine and feminine. So there's no one over the other, even though they may separate certain tasks. Men tend to hunt, women tend to cook. But then other activities, hunters, when they come back in the early morning, look after the young children, and as they kind of sleep when the women go off to the garden. So actually men do childcare. So it's not as one might think it is, but so there is division of labor. But otherwise, it's obvious that life is androgynous or bisexual or masculine and feminine. And there is not a hierarchy, but an association of contraries or complementary, or however you wish to call it. And well, pretty much yin yang once again. The idea that the white part of the yin-yang symbol is more important than the black part is ridiculous. There's not a Taoist in the world who thinks that. Well, then, so along come these Westerners And forever they've been putting masculine above feminine, and the whole patriarchal thing, and then the hierarchical society, and so hierarchies everywhere. But then when finally they get to the point where they think, okay, well, maybe we've been dominating nature a little bit too much. So then they turn it into Mother Nature. And nature becomes this benevolent thing, and it's feminine. Okay. So who's going to bemoan the absence of masculine at this point? We've had so much, we've been spoon-fed so much masculine, it's almost a relief. And I think that's the whole point, except that, Mother Nature, excuse me, but nature is shot. It's entirely bisexual. It's Father Nature, if you want to sort of use those words. To suggest otherwise is biologically ridiculous.
I'll just a feminine word in German as well.
Die Natur, I think so. La nature in French. Yeah. La naturaleza in Spanish. Yeah. Well, then, okay, so that's just Mother Nature. So what about Mother Ayahuasca? Okay, well, here come the Westerners again. They're going down to the Amazon. They're drinking ayahuasca. Are they asking the indigenous people about the gender of ayahuasca? No. But what if they did? Well, this is what they would tell them, because actually indigenous Amazonian people, interestingly enough, ascribe gender to these different teacher plants. Many of them have female gender ascriptions. Tobacco is a rare plant that is ascribed a masculine energy or identity or personality. There is some confusion because Amazonian people talk about the mother of a plant, but actually they also talk about the owner of a plant or the father of a plant. But the Westerners have mainly retained mother of ayahuasca, mother of tobacco, and so on. But actually, so yes, and the Amazonian people will answer, yes, these plants have mothers if you ask them, or fathers, yes, they have owners, yes. So the mother of tobacco, well, the mother of tobacco is a man. Hold on, the mother is a man? Yes, that's right. The mother or the owner of the plant is a masculine entity. Okay, well, that's tobacco. So tell me about this entity. Oh, it's a tall man. It has a masculine energy and so forth. And actually, across dozens of indigenous cultures, they agree about this. Okay, so what about ayahuasca? Well, the whole point about ayahuasca is that it can take many forms, and it sometimes takes the form of a hummingbird, other times a boa, sometimes white doctors and nurses, men and women. It can appear as a beautiful young woman. It can appear as a wise old man. It can appear in many different forms, and that's the whole point. It has no fixed identity. There's certainly no fixed gender identity. And so the mother or the father or the owner of ayahuasca can be many things and is certainly masculine and or feminine.
And that's ubiquitous across.
That's ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And actually, in the last little book that I did with Rafael Chanchari, we discussed that, and I give a whole bunch of examples in the notes for those who want to go looking. So you can find indigenous people who will tell you that at a precise moment they perceived the mother of tobacco as a female entity, but you can find just as many who will tell you that they perceived it as a male entity, and others yet who's neither male nor female, but a hummingbird or a boa or so forth. And then it transforms, and that's the whole point. It has no fixed identity. This doesn't mean that indigenous Amazonian people are necessarily right about this. I mean, who's to say who's right about this? But The Westerners who plod into the Amazon and who are new kids in town, and they're saying, "Oh well, grandmother ayahuasca told me this, and grandmother ayahuasca told me that, and she's such a wise," so forth. You know, you think, "Oh man, would you just shut up?"
Is that a case of priming and kind of see what you want to see?
You know, I don't know what's in their minds. You'd have to ask them. I don't know why they do it. It gets on my nerves.
It would be interesting to find out like how many people just experience that as a feminine energy because of that priming. Because it's extended to peyote as well, isn't it? Where it's like grandmother ayahuasca and grandfather peyote, and I have no idea what the Wararika actually.
You know, it probably takes roots in well-meaning stuff, and you know, the plant world, I don't know, for some reason is somehow feminine, and you know, the feminine is good, and indigenous people are somehow, you know, defending nature, so they're defending the feminine, and you know, and so feminizing ayahuasca is perceived as a form of respect or something like that. You know, it's I feel a little bit like the Grinch, you know, saying that grandmother ayahuasca gets on my nerves.
No, it's incredibly irritating. I completely agree. Incredibly irritating.
But because if people want to, and that's the other thing, is that, you know, you believe what you want to. Personally, I'm not really interested in believing at all. I'm interested in knowing. You know, I don't know the, I think who is the owner of ayahuasca? What is the real personality of that plant? The living entity that corresponds to that species, just what is the most exact way of thinking about it? I'm interested in other people's views. I think the views of Amazonian people at least have the legitimacy of time. They've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. That's also what's annoying about the Western grandmother ayahuasca thing, is that Westerners have just strolled into the Amazon yesterday morning, and they're coming out with these certitudes that I think were in their own minds to start with.
Exactly.
And someone tried to patent it as well about maybe 20 years ago now, didn't it? How did they feel about that?
How did they feel about patenting it? Oh, how did Amazonian people? They hated it. And there was unanimous disagreement. This was like one more outrageous vampire act. And actually, they had no qualms about using the word sacred, which they'd understood was a word that hit the nerve. They were saying, for us, ayahuasca is as sacred as that wafer you eat on Sunday morning is. Imagine if we had put a patent on those wafers.
That's a really pulling in of the other cosmology.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, that's one thing about Amazonian tactics is they are hunters. And if you want to hunt game, that one of the best ways to go about it is to imitate the animal's sound. You know, so you learn to speak like white people to go to where you want to go in today's world.
Well, my friend was asking about that, and this, what was he saying, Mark?
He was asking about when they have the option to choose whether they wear indigenous clothes or jeans, and they sometimes choose to wear jeans to be the most powerful they could possibly be in that moment. And it's this very clever, incredibly sensitive calibration of what will be the most effective thing that means they kind of dovetail between dipping a toe in things outside of their culture and going back to it.
Well, Peter Gao talks about that in the book I was mentioning before. And Pio people, before they had the experience of white people, would paint themselves like anacondas or jaguars. You know, putting patterns on their faces. And anacondas and jaguars are at the top of the food chain. And nobody eats them, and they eat everybody. But once white people showed up, they began dressing like white people, in the same way that you dress like a jaguar, you paint yourself like a jaguar to acquire some of the jaguar's attributes and power. And the same thing with white people. So they have these planes and tools and machetes and all these things. They're powerful. They're also scary. But I'll dress like them to kind of try to get some of their power, basically.
It's all this process of like storytelling, isn't it? It's this sort of like the theatrics, but then that line between theatrics and reality is.
I think that we in Western cultures we would tend to because I agree with you, but I think that we tend to discount theatrics. In other words, we think, oh well, it's just theater, or there's just theatrics. But actually, in the indigenous point of view, theater is extremely important. So that, and you could even say that a shamanic session, and this anthropologists have said this, it's very good theater. It is a moment like at a theater where you have a stage and things are given to see, and a story is told, and as if it's well told, it'll make you travel, and you will understand things, and once you get to the end of it, you will be somehow transformed. That there is a very magical power in theater. It's just like with the word imagination. We say, oh, it's just imagination, but actually the imagination is this very powerful thing. I think that it's also what ayahuasca does, is turbocharge imagination, so that you can imagine. To imagine is to have an image of, and once again, we're talking about seeing, have an image of something that doesn't exist yet, or and that is a human talent. And I think that is also one of the things that ayahuasca and shamanic rituals do, is they empower that capacity to have images, to have visual imagery.
Yes, I think where that becomes a little bit sticky is this distinction that I assume is more of a Western distinction between memory and imagination, where I have no idea about what's a memory and what's imagination most of the time.
Because when you remember, you kind of recreate it as well. So I guess it.
Yeah, I feel like it's all imagination.
Well, that's one of the things we discuss in our book with Rafael Chanchari. I asked him the question: how do you tell the difference between a real vision of a legitimate ayahuasca vision and a projection that's coming out of that you are the source of the image? And he says it's essentially a question of practice, that which means that when you're early in your shamanic career, it's important not to take your visions too seriously. But then you learn to see the difference between what is a projection and what is something that is actually coming from somewhere else and coming into your mind. He says that, interestingly, that sound makes a difference. That when you look at your visions, you don't know exactly whether you're projecting or whether it's coming from outside or elsewhere into your mind. But if you listen to the sound that comes with the vision, that makes it a lot easier to tell. And so one of the keys to being able to work with one's visions is learning to listen to them.
That's interesting. I wonder if that. I'm just thinking if there's this process of sort of everything's got a melody. If you are familiar with your own melody, then that's what you'll hear if you're projecting more than you're receiving. Or I don't know if people hear their own melody.
That's a good question. I've never heard it asked, and I haven't asked it myself, but I've never been told by any practicing shaman that people have their own melody. On the contrary, it's more that the world around us is full of melodies and that we can sometimes perceive them.
But we must be, but we're a part of that. I mean, we must.
You know, that's actually another interesting question. There's a book about the cosmovisions of indigenous Amazonian people by indigenous Amazonian people. It's called El Ojo Verde, the Green Eye. It was published in Peru 20 years ago. And one of the things they lined up 15 different indigenous cultures in the Peruvian Amazon. They all gave their worldview, which are pretty similar worldviews, even though they have their differences. And so all living beings have, each species has an owner, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing they pointed out was that the only species that doesn't have an owner is the human species in Amazonian concepts. And so then there was an anthropologist who wrote an introduction to this book and who commented and speculated. I think it's kind of interesting that perhaps this is because our destiny as a species is to become the shepherd in this world of the other species. That's just a speculation, but it is at least certain that we are the species in Amazonian terms that does not have an owner.
What do they mean by owner?
Well, the owner of tobacco, for example, also known as the mother of tobacco, or the father of tobacco, or the personality of tobacco, is this person-like entity that corresponds to tobacco, oversees all living tobacco plants, and is like a person. So it's a kind of like an energy packet, like you and I are energy packets.
Right.
And so when you see or perceive or feel the mother of tobacco in your visions, it's like meeting somebody. And the mother of tobacco has a very powerful personality, if not to say an addictive personality. And the mother of tobacco can kick you in the pants, can also mislead you. But what does it mean to say exactly? This remains a mystery. I think that rushing to certitudes about these Amazonian points of view, especially when speaking in English or in Western tongues, is complicated. But what does it mean that a plant like tobacco or a plant like IO or any plant or any animal has an owner that's a species level entity?
It's almost like Platonism, that sort of the world of
It is. You're right. It is like Platonism. And it's like there is jaguar-ness in all jaguars. And even though individual jaguars are different, each individual jaguar embodies jaguar-ness. And so the essence of jaguar, or the personality of jaguar, it is quite different from the essence of wild boar or of tobacco. These are living species. They're powerful, but they're different. And there's no doubt that jaguar nests and wild boar nests are different energy packages. So that's what they're talking about. And it is interesting that they do not ascribe any precise personality identity to humans. It's almost on the contrary. Some of these Amazonian shamans say, because I asked them, so what's the difference between humans and animals? Do you think there is a difference? So after a long silence, one fellow said, well, we can transform into jaguars in our minds, but jaguars don't do this. Of course, how do we know? How does he know that jaguars don't do this? But at least that's their point of view, is that humans have this capacity to imagine themselves jaguars. We don't have a humanness like a jaguar has a jaguarness that somehow limits it into being a jaguar. I'm not saying that this is what I think or believe. I'm saying this is what Amazonian people say, and they are, as far as I'm concerned, the experts on this stuff. It's all a little bit esoteric. I mean, define jaguarness. Well, that's complicated. But still, what is interesting, and let's remain agnostic on the incapacity of jaguars to imagine themselves human. But still, it does seem to be one of humanity's strengths is that we can project ourselves into many other living beings and into situations that don't exist yet. We can imagine the future. We can invent new things. We have this kind of, we're not limited by a precise set of attributes so that every day we get up and have to, I mean, every day a jaguar wakes up, that jaguar has to be a jaguar. We can actually wake up and, we can be an elephant in the morning and a dog in the afternoon and an amoeba in the evening if we want to. I mean, if we're good enough.
I think you can make some generalizations like sort of warm things and soft things. You could say that all humans would.
But your jaguar moment that you describe in your most recent book with the tobacco, that definitely seemed in the narration of it as though the experience and the tobacco allowed you to have some new kind of prowess at inhabiting that state that was beyond what one could necessarily do with imagination or might have been possible before that point.
Yeah, well, I think psychoactive plants open doors that might otherwise stay closed and turbocharge imagination. But some people have very powerful imaginations and can do it all naturally, let's say, au naturel. But as a kind of a hard-boiled rationalist myself, I've gained a lot by taking these shortcuts, really. Because once you knock open the door in your mind with a dose of tobacco and you experience for 15 minutes feeling intensely like a jaguar, then that door stays open. And even if you are an agnostic rationalist, you can go back there if you want and reimagine it. I found it really precious, in fact. So I don't know if that responds to your statement.
It's theatre, right? It's like putting your favorite jacket on when you need to go and like do something.
Yes, having these things that make you feel different in a way that nothing else can when you need it.
I think that like Greek theater with masks, I think masks are these incredible, it was carnival just around here. And, you put a mask on and then you can be, in Greek, mask means person. Or rather persona, it means mask before it means anything else. So it means like a character, so you put on the elephant mask and you are an elephant. And so what's your persona today? Oh, I'm an elephant today. And that's where the word person comes from the word for mask. But that is to say that being in a theater and putting on a mask actually can be a very magical, transformational experience, which is, I think, what you were just saying.
And is that a society that's working with a much greater alacrity to ego dissolution than we have currently established, so they're much more able to just put the mask on and go? Or do you think that's something that comes back to everyone naturally?
Well, the Amazonian people that I lived with, they would paint their faces on a regular basis for pleasure, to go hunting, for a sunscreen, clearly to channel the energy of some animal, because they felt like it. So they use that stuff I wouldn't dream of going into the town near where I live with my face painted. Everybody would say, this guy, what's wrong with this guy? Unless it was carnival or something. But in the Amazon, it's just completely normal to do that. So the whole world is a stage, in other words.
But that is something you've held on to in a sort of in a more imaginative sense, this sort of becoming other creatures. And
I'll tell you, I've got up in front of audiences, and in my mind, I was a jaguar, but they didn't have to know. I was just staring them down. And it would sort of put a complete quietness in the room. Everybody's there waiting for this guy to say something. You just stare them down as if you couldn't care less what they think, and that you might actually leap on them if they're not careful. And it's a fairly I found it to be fairly effective. I'm not saying I do this all the time, but just that I have done it. And you don't have to paint your face. It's a question of what you're actually thinking.
But do you think that superpowers come from those experiences, say with tobacco, where you had that embodied?
Well, like I say, once the experience opened the door.
Yeah.
But actually 20 years later, standing up in front of the audience, it's more just going back through that door and using the imagination to embody it.
Right. And that will of course be having all kinds of physiological effects as well. That'll be changing your heart rate and everything if you're really using your imagination effectively.
I think so. It probably does. It'd be measurable. It probably does make the heartbeat less strong. When you get up in front of a big audience, your heart can sort of run away sometimes, even if you're used to it. And using that kind of technique can maybe help. I wasn't measuring it at the time, so I can't say, but I was using it for sure.
Have you ever needed to suddenly snap out of Jaguar modes? Or does it always usually happen at a time when it's helping you?
No, I've never needed to snap out of it, and I think it would be fairly easy to do. And that's also the thing about imagination, is that you can be in that mode, and then you can just snap out of it just like that if you need to.
I was going to ask about this idea of plant medicine and this idea of medicine. Is that a Western projection to some degree?
Well, once again, these words, like in quite a few Amazonian languages, the word for medicine and the word for poison is the same word.
Right.
Which is closer to the Greek pharmakon, the Greeks had that same principle. We've gone down the path where medicine is one thing and poison is the opposite. But even Paracelsus said that it's a question of doses. That at one dose it'll be a medicine, and at another dose it'll be a poison.
So that's not a dichotomy that you find in Amazonian.
No, it's sort of what is it? Medicine/poison. It's I mean, classically they'll run into a plant, bite a leaf, taste it. If it's bitter, it has alkaloids. This means it might have poison, it might have medicine. It means it's interesting, it has some power. Let's check it out. And if it has poison, we can use it to kill. And if it is medicine, we can use it to heal. And that there's not this huge dichotomy between healing and harming, or medicine and poison. It's all one song, really.
How do the two ayahuascas, the yellow one and the black one, and the fact that the black one's used for darker magic and most people prefer to have the light one, how does that, just remembering the beginning of your book where you described that, and how does that factor into the idea of there being less of a distinction between kind of medicine and poison, and that dichotomy not being as prevalent?
Well, I think it's indigenous people recognize there are different kinds of ayahuasca with different propensities, and then it's really what you're after. And when Westerners come down for healing, they should probably stay away from the black ayahuasca, if only because they're beginners. And I don't think Westerners need any sort of further sorcery-oriented power exacerbations. They probably have enough of that kind of stuff to deal with.